Thanks, Joanne, and welcome everyone. This is kind of a quiet time in the early February part of the season now. I mean, there's absolutely nothing of any significance happening on TV this weekend. Some of you may have just kind of fallen asleep with the slow political news the last couple of weeks. But you're here today, I compliment you that, to listen to one of your favorite topics, which is the bipartisan coalition building within the Texas state government. So we're going to have a little bit of a different type of format today. This is not a panel discussion, it's not a debate. Our goal is to have a casual but informative discussion with the two people up here with me. Mackowiak, who's the chairman of the Travis County Republican Party, and Phillip Martin, he's the executive director of the Texas House Democratic Caucus. The intent here is to find out where there could be some common ground between the Republicans and Democrats in the new Texas legislature. And in the process, we are going to demonstrate here to our national leaders how this type of thing should be done. Okay. So we got together ahead of time and exchanged some emails and picked a couple of topics to at least start the discussion. We'll go on for 45 minutes to an hour or so, and then we'll open it up to general audience questions and comments. But before that, I'd like to just have this informal discussion going on here. The list of topics we want to cover initially are preferential voting, instant runoff voting, how to enable and encourage greater voter participation, election security, and school finance and property taxation. Okay?
We'll be here all afternoon.
So we'll start with the easy one. These are, the first one, preferential voting, instant runoff voting, is not one where there's a clear divide and the cultural wars have started on yet. It's also called ranked choice voting. And one of the motivation factors is that Austin recently had 5 runoff elections for city council and other offices because no one candidate in a field of multiple candidates achieved over 50% of the vote in the first election. They cost somewhere over $500,000 to do this, had incredibly low voter turnout that selected the final, the winner of it, less than 10% of voters in most cases. And the question is the state of Texas or the parties ready to do this in a better way? I'm assuming most of you know something about ranked choice voting or instant runoff voting, where you, instead of just picking one candidate, you pick your first choice, second choice, and third choice. And if someone doesn't get 50% on the first vote, there's a process where you start selecting some of the second and third choice voters that have been cast. So without going into detail here, let's start with that fairly easy question. Do we see prospects for the Texas state legislature to address this? What would be a common compromise that would allow this to happen on a state level? And what about the party primaries themselves, where this could be an issue? And I'm not sure that is a Texas legal issue, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. The parties may be able to do what they want. But instant runoff voting, who would like to tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. Well, thanks everyone. Real quick, I grew up here in Austin, and I used to watch puppet shows in this room here with Mary and Pepe. I grew up as a kid, so it's really fun to be here and talking to y'all today in that space. Don't have a puppet show for you though, unfortunately, so we'll just have a normal conversation. Broadly speaking, I think instant runoff voting has been in use in some places for a long time. I know that Cambridge has used it since the 40s, I believe. Berkeley adopted it in 2004. A lot of municipalities tend to use it for city elections, which tend to be nonpartisan anyways. The state of Maine adopted it in 2016. So I think it's an interesting process. It hasn't been introduced yet in the legislature, so I think that's probably its biggest first hurdle, is the conversation hasn't really been played out yet inside the building. And typically it might take at least 2 to 3 to 4 sessions for a bill that isn't a high priority bill from a statewide official or somebody in kind of higher senior position in the majority party to which of course the Republican Party here in Texas, to pursue it. But I think on its face, it's really interesting it's an interesting thing to look at. I don't know, like I'm happy to kind of go into those pros and cons. I think that Democrats and Republicans would see it for their own primaries in the general election. I don't know if you have any general ideas first, Matt, that you want to talk about, and we can get into that after.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, elections are different, whether they be state versus municipal, obviously, versus federal. And so I guess one of the first questions would be, would a state law even affect a municipal election? I don't think it would. I think that preferential vote, first of all, I agree with Phillip. I don't see significant momentum or consensus behind any particular proposal. Doesn't mean that that there are discussions, that there are people that are wanting to have that conversation. Doesn't mean that there won't be a consensus or momentum at some point. I do agree that runoffs at the city level are a waste of taxpayer dollars and have very, very, very low turnout. The advantage to runoffs is it does focus the voters on the two top candidates. It gives the voters a better chance to evaluate those two candidates, to let those candidates campaign. I believe the runoff was 10 days or something before Christmas, right in the middle of Hanukkah. Not an ideal time frame. So it's more on the general election side. It's more an issue at the municipal level because we don't have primaries, right? Primaries have a funnel effect of moving a large number of candidates to the strongest ones. On the state side, obviously, the application would probably be more for primaries. They have even lower turnout, and primaries are actually technically held by the parties. They're not technically held by the state or by the county. The parties contract with the counties to hold the election, but it's actually each individual party that certifies the results, that certifies who the candidates are, and things like that. One of the advantages of not having a preferential voting system is ultimately, requires a majority of everyone that voted to choose the winner. And that does give that person a mandate. If in a preferential voting system, you could have a winner get 30-35% of the first round votes. Does that person really have a mandate? It's a good question, I think. So obviously, you want to balance the desire for a clear majority of the electorate to signal its preference with not letting a very, 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 very small number of people make ultimate decisions that are going to affect a large constituency. So how you balance those two factors in the right way, perhaps you could just do it on the municipal level initially, do it as a pilot type of situation perhaps. So I think it's something that's going to be discussed going forward, and I don't really see a partisan advantage or disadvantage one way or the other. I think so much of it's going to depend on who the candidates are, the campaigns they run, where the election's being held. I don't really see an advantage, one way or the other. Changes to elections at the state legislature are not easy. Generally the people that are there are comfortable with the system as it exists because they got elected there in the first place. And they know that making changes, creates new variables and creates unpredictability. That said, there was a rare bipartisan consensus that formed over several sessions in the last legislative session when they ended straight ticket voting, which ended in the November 2016 election. Unless the laws changed again, you won't be able to vote straight ticket, which I think both parties agreed would remove what am I trying to say? Would sort of level the playing field a bit and would basically reward candidates who run better campaigns. Sort of remove the advantage of down ballot candidates who really may not have earned every vote they're getting. So what you're going to have, and of course it's going to be highly variable 2 years from now, but you're going to have much lower votes, much more undervotes down ballot, particularly in races where people don't know the candidates. So that one reform took some time, failed several times when they tried to institute it. It's obviously not a preferential system, but I'd only mention it to say that to do this, you're going to have bipartisan consensus, and everyone to kind of come to the view that it's not advantaging one party over the other. Sure.
Yeah, on straight ticket voting. Sorry, one second. I know that there's like from a good government standpoint, certainly, and my wife is one who's very much like doesn't care about political parties at all and gets mad at me sometimes that I focus a lot on the Democratic Party. You should be voting for the person, not the party. And I think there's a lot of value in that, certainly. There's definitely strong opposition from Democrats, though, and on the House side at least, to the elimination of straight ticket voting. So we'll see. And some of the consensus was there was concern that like Harris County and some of these larger counties where Democrats were becoming majority control and some Republican candidates were losing more down ballot, and that kind of is what finally pushed it over the line, especially with the lieutenant governor, I think, last session. That said, like I'm interested to see what happens, and I do think you should have to earn your vote. I think that's a very fair argument to be made. Going back to kind of the instant runoff discussion, I'm curious to see what happens. I know in the primary process, again, this is something where if you're advocating within the Democratic or Republican Party, they could change their rules. You'll remember the Democratic Party in Texas here changed the rules from the two-step primary process, which happened under Clinton and Obama in 2008, to now they've done away with the two-step process.
Could you explain that a little bit?
Sure. The number of delegates that were awarded to presidential candidates in Texas used to go from both election day voting, then also there was at the county elections, you would have certain percentage of votes that you could be awarded, delegates that could be awarded there. So for example, but again, so Hillary Clinton won in 2008, the primary on that election day, but Obama actually won kind of in the follow-through with the organizing that came meeting after. So in the end, he actually had more delegates from Texas, even though she won more votes around the normal traditional election. This was very unique. Texas is the only state that did it. The Democrats were like, okay, this is too much of a problem. Let's move away from that. Which has a whole dovetail of arguments. If you want to chat after this, we can go into that. On the instant runoff, though, what's interesting to me is, for example, if you look forward to the 2020 presidential primaries, there might be 4 candidates that I think are good. And I could vote 1, 2, 3, 4 in the order that I like them. And if the first person I really like, I'm not throwing away my vote because I really want to vote for somebody and somebody else could still be lifted up. I think there's a certain elimination process there that could be interesting. And at the same time, if I think there's only one candidate that's earned my vote, I just vote for that one candidate. And I've chosen not to vote and support anybody else. So I think that there's some merits to it. I do think that it'd be good to be played out on the local levels, because I think folks who vote in local elections tend to be the most educated voters, and I think it's important that those who participate and choose to participate in democracy are comfortable with the systems and know what's there for them. And having everyone have exposure to that would be interesting. I also just think the city of Austin should be doing it. Again, I agree that we should save taxpayer money. There's also just statewide level. There's so many special elections we've had over the last couple of years. We had 3 different state house races because Democrats have been appointed or resigned for different reasons. I think it'd be kind of save us a cost-saving measure there. And the only other thing that popped to mind, it actually could be, and I'm being transparent here, if we were to implement it, let's say with state elections, looking at house races, there's a chance that Republicans could actually stand to benefit some, I think, from this. If you look at races where maybe if you had instant runoff and Democrat candidate got 48% and the Republican got 47% and a Libertarian Party candidate got 4 or 5, well, the second choice for the Libertarian candidate might very likely be a Republican. I know there's, again, being transparent, Democrats try to recruit Libertarians into races to pull some votes away from the Republicans, and the Republican Party, especially in 2010, did a great job of getting Green Party candidates on the ballot to pull away from potential Democratic voters. But I think that's kind of the protection of the two-party system, is kind of the resistance you'd see there from the legislature. Whereas if I knew I could cast my ballot for a Green Party candidate or a Libertarian candidate, but even knowing they may not win, but I want to show this is who I really think could be done, knowing that even if they fall off, my vote will still count for the other person I prefer next. I think it's an interesting experience, it'd be an interesting exercise. And I think Maine just put that into place with all state and federal. I haven't seen how that's played out. I haven't gone through and studied any of those races, but those are some of the thoughts I think I had on that.
I think there was, go ahead.
Sorry, yes.
If you have another comment, that's okay. I want to give a little bit of history for why this is on this.
Sure.
We're going to talk about. So the reason that I particularly brought this topic up is that I'm an election judge, and on December 11th, I sat as an election judge in a precinct. Actually, it was 2 precincts that were combined. So it was, 14 hours of work to process 30 voters. So I was sort of incensed. And I thought to myself, well, if Maine can do this, what's preventing municipalities in the state to do the same thing? Well, what the complication is that in 1985, preferential voting, which includes instant runoff voting, was taken out of the election code in Texas. In 1999, Glenn Maxey, when he was a House representative, filed a bill to reinstate the possibility of preferential voting as an option for municipalities to consider whether they wanted to do so. It wasn't a mandate, it was just an option. It never went anywhere. But since then this small group of folks who are part of the advocacy arm of Common Ground for Texans said, well, why don't you talk to Glenn Maxey and see what he says? And he was up and running and ready to refile. So he, in fact, did refile, and the reason he refiled was that we had a Republican lawyer who is also in favor of this particular ability to restore this option for municipalities, is willing to move this bill through the House and the Senate. So we have a Republican who's willing to go to Republican legislators to get authors for the bill. We have Democrats who are willing to go to Democratic legislators to get them to author the bill, so that we can have a coalition of legislators who are willing to allow this to be an option at the municipality level. And that's about where we've started.
Okay.
I'll just add one quick note, is that there's a lot of discussion about divisions between Democrats and Republicans, especially in Texas. One thing that's been really great in recent years, the Republican Party of Texas and the Democratic Party of Texas, they both often have extensive conversations leading up to the election and right now in January about election reforms each party would like to see. And where they find agreement, common ground, they go forward, they kind of split the bills, and those move pretty quickly through the system, and they get passed. And there tends to be some of the smaller changes to stuff, but that is a process that exists. So even though you might have parties on opposite sides, I think there is that space for those conversations that exists already at the state level and the county level, and you might have experience with that here in Travis County as well. But I think it's a good positive to just keep in mind.
Yeah, and I think based on what Joanne was saying, I think that the state giving the ability to municipalities, if they choose to proactively do it, that's a great option, because then it's up to the cities. It's not the state, mandating it. It's always a safer, place for any elected official to be, to let either, elected officials at another level, or ideally voters, ratify or make their voice heard before taking some type of step. So I imagine there'd probably be very little resistance to that, but be interested to see. It's to me, even though preferential voting's been around a while, in some areas it's I think not really been on the radar in Texas all that much. So I do think new ideas generally do need to be vetted, particularly as they relate to elections, because there's such sensitivity for incumbents.
Okay, any final comments?
Oh, the Oscars do preferential voting, so thinking about whether or not it actually works. Sorry.
That's good. This is meant to be civil and informative. We're doing this so far. But now let's turn up the heat a little bit. Finding common ground and how to encourage greater voter participation. This could include things like online voter registration, automatic voter registration when you get a driver's license or renew it, for example. Same-day voter registration. What about these options? Do we expect any possibility of common ground there?
I think we're getting pretty close on online voter registration. I know the discussions are going pretty well last session on that, and I think they just fizzled with some of the details. So I'm hopeful that that one is one that can be discussed and debated fully in the committees, both on the House and Senate side, to kind of hear out the arguments. I know certainly House Democrats generally support same-day voter registration, automatic voter registration, anything that is more inclusive to people going through the process, especially given how many kind of checks there are already to ensure that people who are registering are who they say they are, and there's such a heavy focus on that kind of side of things of preventing people and making sure that we are accurately counting and everyone's voting that should be voting. It'd be nice if we had a little bit more inclusionary, I think, laws and inclusionary vision and really language that was put forward by the state. But I think that's gonna, right now that's not, I don't have a lot of hope for a lot of those issues beyond online voter registration, which again, I think there's a lot of merit and the parties came close last session on it, from my understanding.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to remember exactly the process, but I mean, I believe that we have basically motor voter here in Texas, right? So you can register when you get your driver's license. I know it's not automatic, but it's also not a particular burden. I think the argument against same day is generally campaigns want to target and direct all their activities to registered voters. And if someone doesn't register until election day, it's too late to try to persuade that voter that you're the right candidate. So I think there probably would be some challenges there in terms of how Republicans would look at that issue. In terms of online, I mean, as long as the cybersecurity aspect of that was really solid, I can't imagine a problem in that area. I haven't heard a lot of discussion and momentum and focus on these kinds of issues for this legislative session. This session's going to be focused on some other areas, I think. But I was actually just listening to the Lieutenant Governor yesterday at a lunch, and he said, the Senate passed, I forget what the number was, almost 1,900 bills last session, and only 23 of them were Republicans only. I mean, the vast majority of bills. That's in the Senate, right? The perception is the Senate is far more partisan than the House. You always have a stronger, opportunity to move anything forward if you have bipartisan support on the front end, and obviously if you work through the committees, work through the chairs, and try to get members of committees, to, particularly both sides, to really try to push it forward.
So this is the 21st century, and about 25 states have some form of online voting. Now sometimes it's limited to just
Registration.
no voting. Online voting. Sometimes it's limited to overseas military people, but they do have some sort of online voting, and various states have various provisions for doing that. Is there any interest
In allowing people to vote online?
Yeah.
I don't think there's a lot of interest for actual voting online. I'll just speak on behalf, legislators haven't been filing the bills. That's kind of not where the focus has been as far as some of the electionary improvements. So not speaking to the merits of the issue, just being a realistic snapshot of where the legislature is, I don't think that's a conversation that's even brought up very much. I think that we have, it's a tough balance, I think, for how secure these kinds of things are. Because I think the Secretary of State, they were very clear that the election security, the Texas systems were secure and followed all these other procedures. They did implement, we got $23 million from the federal government through the Help America Vote Act to help with election security. At the same time, the Republican Party platform in Texas calls for the repeal of the Help America Vote Act. You have Republicans at the Senate Intelligence Committee that are very honest and being good about election security and talking about what we need to have fixes, but then on the House side, they don't put more money in to kind of help that kind of stuff. So it's a balancing act, and there's a professor from Rice, there's a great article in Texas Monthly that discussed some of the things you need to fix for election security, things like, scrap paperless voting, you need to have a paper trail for that kind of stuff, you need to update machines. The big thing around the Beto Cruz race was like, oh, I'm pressing Beto and Cruz is showing up. Nobody's doing anything. That wasn't anybody oh, I'm screwing you. This was a Simpsons episode or a Simpsons joke. It's just these are old machines. Some of these are decades old machines, and counties don't have money. They haven't received money to replace those types of voter machines, and the cost was going to be $350 million, which is about, nationally, there's $380 million to help with election security improvements. In the state of Texas, we need $350 million just to support 254 counties' new voting machines. So those are the types of things that, online voting, of course, you wouldn't have to do that. You wouldn't have to spend that kind of money, but you need the kind of data and technology security improvements on the front end. And I personally, right now, I would rather us identify ways to do paperless ballot things and other types of stuff first. Until I have more confidence in hacks not being a threat.
Yeah, I don't see a lot of momentum behind a push for online voting. I would agree with him that the security issues, I think, are considerable. You'd also want to be certain that the person who says they're voting is the person that's actually voting. It's a lot harder to do that in person, obviously, not 100% foolproof, but it's a lot harder. You know, one of the things that does bother me sometimes is the criticism that Texas, quote, makes it hard to vote. I'm sure there are things that the state could do to make it even easier for people to vote. But if you think about it, right, we have 2 full weeks of early voting, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., including the weekend. I mean, unless you are literally working 6 days a week or 7 days a week, you know, a full work schedule, 10, 12, 14 hours a day, including the weekend, early voting alone makes it possible for every single Texan to vote if they want to vote. Then, of course, you have election day. And unless you are in an hourly job or something like that, you probably can get a part of your day, again, starting at 7 a.m., all the way going to 7 p.m. You obviously have vote by mail that's available without question to seniors. And then I believe if you're under 65, I believe you have to have some type of excuse. And I think there are categories for that. I forget the rules on it. But my point is, you know, the idea that the burdens are significant to voting in Texas, I just think that is not borne out by the opportunities that are there for people to vote. So obviously we want as many people to participate as possible. One of the really positive things about this midterm, even though the outcome was you know, negative from a Republican standpoint, was that we had massive turnout. I mean, massive turnout, driven to a great extent by, you know, the enthusiasm Beto created, driven by, you know, interest in national politics, driven by all the people who moved here, driven by, you know, the fact that you had competitive races all over the state at all levels. It's a very positive thing, and I think we're going to have very high turnout in Texas in 2020 as well.
Yeah, Texas being a non-voting state can be just as much the fact that we haven't had competitive elections as anything else for a long time. Now, of course, that's a byproduct of redistricting maps that have prevented competitive races in a lot of spaces, and this happened last decade. You get to the end, and you know, the lines that we drew have been blurred a little bit by people moving and people changing their minds, and so then we get closer and closer in the House, and then draw maps again that obviously stop that, so that they aren't competitive races. You don't have as much a chance to weigh in. So that's something that has to be balanced. One thing that was interesting when I was researching and prepping for this is that so the Secretary of State does provide training on election security best practices for local counties, but it's not required by state law. It's voluntary, and when you look at these counties and the resources they have, like, you know, they would love to do it, but like as a Secretary of State's not going to proactively go and travel without being asked, and they're not going to push people to ask because they don't have a budget to be doing traveling. And that's a relatively small cost, but you know, you hired another couple people at the Secretary of State's office and got a little travel budget for them and made it a requirement that the counties had to have this in-person training on election security. That's a low-cost, common-sense kind of thing that I think could be done that I'm hoping the legislature pursues. I only learned about it in doing this research. I'm going to introduce it to some folks, and I think it's the kind of, you know, there's these kind of positive steps that could be taken.
I'll say one last thing, if it's okay. My understanding is Travis County is moving to new voting machines next election, yes. So it will be a better system. And I know you mentioned the thing about trying to vote for Beto and vote for Cruz. We had complaints that it was literally the opposite in Travis County on election day as well. So I know that there was, you know, some publicity around that. I don't know the details of how that all got worked out. Ultimately, it didn't affect, you know, the outcome. The margin was, you know, 2.6%, which was large enough that it wouldn't have been affected by a small number of anecdotal complaints like that, but
every vote counts.
Oh, no doubt. No doubt. And listen, and we told everyone who called us, you know, make your complaint, you know, file your report, do it on site. You know, one of the challenges you have is if you have something happen in the election, you know, in the voting booth, and you come home and call someone to say it happened, you're not there, you know, to report it in real time. So you always have to do that in real time.
There's also just a public perception problem. You know, if a website goes down, or there's things on the Secretary of State site or county website, these numbers don't match up, or these numbers showed this vote total and now it shows 0, and like, oh, it's been hacked. Well, that's just the public-facing site. That could literally just be a coding error somewhere. It doesn't mean that the votes are being counted one way or the other. So there's 4 different kind of components. You got the equipment, the actual database online, the management and the canvassing of the votes, and then the public-facing sites. So the problem is the public-facing sites are the things we see first, and we kind of get panicked about the most, but that actually has no evidence that the votes or the election has in any way been rigged or changed. So it's a complicated topic, election security, but it's a good conversation to have.
So you both brought up election security. Let's dive into that. And it's become a little bit more interesting lately because our Secretary of State put out this list of 98,000 residents who weren't citizens when they got their driver's license, but nevertheless are registered to vote now. And he says 58,000 of them have voted in the last 20 years and asked that this be looked into. Given this, there's also a fact that in the last 20 years or so, 2 people have been convicted of voting illegally in Texas. Is there even agreement, consensus that this is a problem? What do you think the state legislature might do here?
I don't know that they're necessarily going to do anything. I don't know that it's really a legislative question. Obviously, the sort of the headlines and the focus on the overall numbers, I think, kind of overtook the reality of what this thing was. These were so-called weak matches. You know, there was no one was ever saying all 95,000 who got driver's license initially when they weren't citizens could not be a legal voter now. It appears that 2/3 or more of them have been naturalized in that intervening 20-year period, which makes them a legal voter. You know, I think that obviously they could have gone about this better, clearly, and it's, I'm sure, undermined public confidence in the Secretary of State's office, and that's regrettable. I do think if you look below the headline to what they actually said, they just said to the counties, we're sending you the lists of people who weren't citizens when they got their driver's license. We want you to verify that they're a legal voter now. You know, counties look at their lists and clean up their lists every election cycle. So this is not about, you know, a massive purge. It's not about, I don't believe it violated the law. I have really be shocked if both the Attorney General's office and the Secretary of State's office, you know, aligned on this effort, and it ultimately was a violation of law. I know there's been some lawsuits filed, so ultimately we'll see how that gets resolved. I just think they probably could have been a little bit more clear at the beginning, and sort of, I think in some ways, I don't know whether they really pushed the overall numbers, but I think people that obviously want to push this voter fraud narrative in Texas seized on those numbers, and you know, those numbers were never going to be, like I said, the final result. The final result was always going to be less. It was going to be a question of how much less. You know, do I believe voter fraud is an issue in Texas? I do. Do I believe it is a major issue? No. Do I believe it has affected, you know, more than a small handful of races in recent years? No. But we've had, I forget, Derek Ryan, who used to work at the state party, who's kind of a data guy on the Republican side, put a list together. I don't remember the exact number, but he had 20 or 50 races on there that were, you know, in the last 5 or 6 years that were decided by, you know, 30 votes or less. Voter fraud does not happen in person very often. Where I believe it is more evident is in mail ballots and ballot harvesting, those kinds of things. Again, the absence of evidence isn't evidence, right? And the Attorney General's office has been prosecuting voter fraud more aggressively. There was a high-profile case up in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. There have been several in South Texas. I agree, it's a very small number. And honestly, I believe he only has one person who's focusing on voter fraud in the Attorney General's office. So you can imagine there's just a capacity personnel limitation there. So again, I don't think it's rampant. I don't think it's, you know, the difference between you know, why races are going one direction or the other. But I do believe that, you know, the integrity of our election system is something that we never want to be questioned. We want to believe that every election is being conducted fairly, and even one vote, you know, that's cast illegally, you know, kind of undermines another legal vote. So I think, you know, I don't want to go overboard with it, but I think we want to be smart and careful, and that's part of why we have election administrators, why we have election offices. It's part of the responsibility of the Secretary of State's office to administer elections.
Phil, and do you think anything's going to happen in the legislature?
I will find out Tuesday, because I think that Governor State of the state, I'd be surprised if he didn't address this. I know they laid out this big revenue cap thing, which we're going to talk about in a second, I'm sure. And the first question was about this kind of debacle that came out of the Secretary of State's office. The reason was the headline was that Attorney General Kim Paxton's press release said, Texas Secretary of State's office discovers nearly 95,000 people identified by DPS or non-citizens. It's his headline. His lead quote is, every single instance of illegal voting threatens democracy. So this was a headline in news because Attorney General Paxton wanted it to be a headline and wanted it to be news. And voter fraud is a common frame that's, you know, cried out, you know, constantly from their party. I think it's also, and this is something I've literally seen these email receipts of the fact that Secretary of State's announcement went out, and within a minute it was the Attorney General, and 2 minutes after that it was Governor Abbott. I mean, this is, by all public-facing things, a coordinated effort. And with the lawsuits and open records requests are trying to come into was this discussed prior? Like, hey, we're going to release this, get ready to put something out, a press release. I'm really good at rapid response. Matt's a fantastic communicator. I can't put out a press release that has 500 words 1 minute after I see a headline. So I don't really know how this couldn't be a coordinated effort and some effort for this. And again, yes, you're looking at the fact that the Secretary of State did say weak matches. And I think if the Attorney General had read the entire release, and maybe he got to the bottom of that, he could have, but I don't know how he could have read the entire release and put out a press release 1 minute after that. So these were weak matches. It was something that Democrats were seizing on right away. Chairman Chia, I know, pointed to that. I think the reports have been coming out ever since as counties have been looking at this. I know you have very small percentages of weak matches, maybe a third, maybe a fifth. In Waco, there was only 0 of the names on their counties in McClellan, sorry. Not a big Waco guy personally. McLennan County, 0 of the 350, 380 so names, none of them actually were an instance. So I think they're going to come back and it's going to be it's a very, very small number of these in the first place. And again, over this 22-year period, which is what they were looking at anyways, 1.1 million Texans were naturalized. And a lot of people who are naturalized, they've gone through an extensive process to become naturalized. And the first thing they want to do is go get those licenses and register to vote. And I have friends of mine, very close friends of mine, who did that in the last election for the first time. So the idea that there are a lot of people who at one time were non-citizens, went to go apply for the driver's license using their green card or Visa card, then proceeded to become naturalized, and then registered to vote, and then cast a ballot, which is the 58,000 number that came out originally. Did that happen? Were there 58,000 people that went through that process out of 1.1 million in a 22-year period? I think so. I think in the end you're going to find maybe 10, 12 total out of this 95,000 figure, which was in the headline of Paxton's press release. That could be an instance for that, and to that extent, I think there's mistakes that happen everywhere, and people do it sometimes because it's very rare that somebody sincerely is trying to manipulate the process. There was, I think, a case I read about this past week where that was the thing. Somebody stole his identity and everything else. But again, there's laws against identity theft. He was prosecuted by those laws. We don't need new laws. We don't need new headlines. It'd be great if the Secretary of State, who should be an umpire and isn't a partisan official, they are the one calling balls and strikes in our elections. The Secretary of State, Attorney General, and the Governor came out and said, this many millions of Texans didn't vote. This is what we're going to do to fix that. If that was the headline and if that was the narrative, I think I'd be much more encouraged about this process. I don't know if we want to do questions yet, but...
We're going to do questions later. I want to get these folks onto the other final interesting topic that the audience may be very interested in hearing. Yeah, so the top 3 state officials have agreed that school spending and education and property tax relief need all to be addressed the term. Depending on which year you looked at, Texas ranked in state school spending from 36th down to 43rd or something like that. Certainly not anywhere near the top. What do we see as a possible bipartisan compromise coming up dealing with education funding and property tax capping or relief?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a consensus that we need to address the school finance system. I think it's very encouraging. Governor Abbott's inaugural address, I probably could have written 95% of it. It was really encouraging to hear that, and I think that elections will do that. Folks showed up and they voted. They saw how close Cruz's race was and Patrick's race, and they saw 12 seats in the legislature flipping to Democrats, which is twice as much as we've had in the last 40 years, and they saw the writing on the walls and a lot of other close races, so they're like, well, we got to actually do something about this. As in so many things, it's going to be in the details, and how aggressive of a school finance overhaul is pursued will be a big key. And there's tons of details in here. I don't know where necessarily, so I'm just going to try to give a quick overview. I think one thing that we've seen is that the governor put out a property tax plan in October, and the press conference here this week was about revenue caps. No one's put forward a plan on schools and how to improve classrooms, for teacher improvement, for classroom improvements, for school finance details. There's a lot of details in there. What is the basic allotment, the raw total we put in per child? That hasn't been raised in a long time. That needs to go up significantly if we want to get a baseline equalization. There's certain weights in the school finance formula relating to special populations, whether those are special education students, which the state is criminally underfunding and was found and discovered by circuit courts, Republican circuit courts, that you're breaking federal law, you need to fix this immediately. There's weights regarding to economically disadvantaged students. 3 in 5 Texas students are economically disadvantaged. There's weights to English language learners. There's 6 different programs for English, which I need right now, obviously, English language learning in classrooms. And you know, all of these extra needs are something that students need more help with. And then before you even get into issues like recapture, which, sorry Austin, fundamentally is a good program and has worked. If you look at the disparity in the weight per student where taxes goes, much worse 2 decades ago. The problem is AISD, Houston ISD also have large populations of economically disadvantaged students, and so those dollars would be better served staying here, but they have to go elsewhere. So you got to fix some of the weights and all those kinds of things too. The reality is we don't know where Republican leaders or Democrats are going to land on a lot of these types of measurements. And then once they put forward a specific formula, they do the school district runs, and that's when every district sees this is how your money was in the past and this is what it'll be next time. And honestly, that's when a lot of the partisanship breaks down completely. Because I'm going to look at the 15 or 50 or 75 school districts that I've got in my district that I represent, and how does it impact them directly. And I think the encouraging thing, and this happened the last time they tried to do this in 5, 6, and 7, is that a lot of the partisanship will fall apart at that point, because they really are trying to see what's best for your local community schools. The challenge is, again, where is the conversation being anchored? And to date, it's anchored in revenue caps and in taxes, and not in just injecting more money into the school formulas. The only last thing I'll say, and I've said a lot on this, but the base budget in the House does add $7 billion to public education, but it also assumes that collections of property tax money are going to increase by 6% in tax year 2019 and 4% in tax year 2020. That could still happen even with revenue caps, because that doesn't impact the appraisal value. But it's going to be much, much harder to realize that type of inflow of money from property taxes with the revenue cap. So at some point, that's going to have to be balanced out for a truly honest school finance fix. And I imagine that will happen day 138, 39, or 40 of the legislature, right about Memorial Day when you're ready to go.
Not
Sorry
a lot
for
of
that.
optimism about bipartisan compromise there.
Oh no, I think there will be. We don't know what it looks like yet. No one's at we know all the, I think there's a very much clearer than the past strong understanding of what needs to be addressed, how we address it. The School Finance Commission has some ideas, there's Republicans and Democrats in the House with some ideas, Lieutenant Governor has some ideas, Senator Nelson has ideas about teacher pay raises. I mean, there's outcomes-based funding, there's merit-based pay, there's across the board. There's all sorts of options on the table, which is great. It's great to be having this conversation in such a serious way, but there's no consensus on moving forward, and the big three haven't given anyone a path yet.
At least you know what dates it will be addressed on. Yes.
Yeah, no, it was a great summary. I mean, I think we heard a lot of that. I mean, there was a property tax focus, last session, and the House and Senate were really not that far apart, but they just really kind of were in a compromising mood. And the Speaker and Lieutenant Governor really hadn't been on the same page, the entire session. And so neither one really wanted to sort of capitulate to the other, even though, one was at 4%, the other was at 6%. They could have been at 5% and probably avoided a special session altogether. So it's a little bit silly. I do think that this session, they're being more serious, more sober about it, in the sense that I think last session they attempted to do property tax without addressing school finance, and now they realize they can't do one without doing both. You can't do either one without doing both. And so I think that is a broad bipartisan belief. That you have to do both together. They're both extremely complicated. It would be hard to do just one of them in 140 days, even harder to do them both in 140 days. I do believe that they're going to try really, really hard to avoid a special session on this. And I do believe that the Republican leadership would like to do this in a bipartisan way. They'd like to do it in a way where it doesn't advantage or disadvantage either party, that it's broadly acceptable. It provides cover, honestly, to Republicans. I think what voters want to see is they don't just want to see the rate of growth of property tax increase reduced, they want to see their property taxes reduced. And we're not, unfortunately, I think, looking at that kind of outcome in this session. I think we're probably looking at solution where they cap the growth perhaps at 2.5%. We'll see. That was kind of the Abbott proposal. What I think is new is you do have a governor, a lieutenant governor, and a speaker that are all on the same page, wanting to get an outcome, not wanting sort of one side to win or have the other side lose, which unfortunately has been, I think, been visible in the last couple of sessions. So, but Philip's exactly right. I mean, there are so many key issues within those umbrella issues that have to still get worked out. Basically, I think what we can say with some confidence is 7, 8, 9 billion extra dollars are going to go to education coming out of this session compared to where we were last biennium. The Senate approach appears to be to take about $4 billion of that. I think it's $3.7 billion to give a $5,000 automatic annual, pay raise to every teacher. That's 350,000 teachers, $5,000 per year is $3.7 billion. So that chews up about half, a little bit less, but perhaps about half of what they want to put to education. I don't believe the current House budget has that pay raise in there. I think they just kind of say, we're going to put all this towards education. My guess is, the ultimate resolution will be probably a raise of a lower level to kind of bring the Senate in line with the House. But he brings up a lot of good points. I mean, special ed is a disaster in Texas. We all know people who've had horror stories. I was just talking to somebody in the north side, the Independent School District, just this week, who's had a horror story for their child. And so it is extremely complicated. No one really understands the formulas for the public education system in Texas. Even people that study it have been on the committees for several sessions. It's highly, highly, highly complicated. And property taxes, obviously, we don't have a statewide property tax. It's set at the county level, but of course, to the extent that the state funds, the state provides funding to the municipalities, that affects, what their rate setting is. Appraisals, I think there is widespread agreement that appraisals are out of control, not just in urban areas and not even just in suburban areas, it's everywhere. You all probably understand this. In Austin, we are currently on a trajectory to double property taxes in Travis County every 9 years, right? It's not sustainable. And honestly, it shouldn't even be necessary. We should be getting a growth dividend from having 100 people move here every day, right? That alone, yes, you have more people you have to provide services to, but presumably the services become more efficient as the number of people you have to serve increases. So there's a lot of frustration. I do believe that everyone realizes they have to get an outcome on property tax and school finance, one that's broadly agreeable. I don't believe it will be a party line kind of approach. Ultimately, it may be that only a third of the Democrats in the House or Senate can ultimately support it. It may not be all of them. We saw Trey Martinez-Fisher and a couple other Democrats give, I think, a press conference on Friday, and they appeared to put sort of pour cold water on the, or maybe it was Thursday, pour cold water on the initial approach. So we'll see. The last point I'll just make is the House and Senate, with their initial bills on property tax, first time in the modern era, they both introduced exactly the same legislation at the same time. Right? Normally what happens is the House and Senate do their own thing, it goes through the process, they go to a conference committee, they try to get a bill that both bodies can agree to. And sometimes they play games. The Senate goes fast on some things, the House goes fast on other, they try to jam the other body at the end, basically. My point is, I don't think that's that kind of gamesmanship, which is very common in the legislature, doesn't appear to be at play here on property tax. But obviously, the devil's in the details, as you said, and there's a lot here that still has to get worked out. We're obviously, again, at the very early stages of legislative session. It's 140 days. The State of the State will be given on Tuesday at 11 a.m. The governor will list what emergency items he offers, and that then gives the Senate an opportunity to take up legislation in the first 60 days. They don't have that opportunity in the House as well in the first 60 days without emergency items being listed. So my point is, I think starting next week, but perhaps even the following week, we're going to start to see bills on the floor related to emergency items, and things are going to start moving pretty quickly. I know I said that's the last thing I was going to say. This is the last thing I'll say. I think the Lieutenant Governor and the Speaker both deserve special commendation for appointing committee chairs and committee members as quickly as they did. I think they both moved about as, the speaker probably moved more quickly than anyone in 50 years. Lieutenant Governor moved very quickly 2 years ago, but historically moved very quickly. That obviously gives every member more time to be on their committees, to start doing the study, to start meeting with constituents and stakeholders, and it's going to give them more time to be legislatively productive.
Yeah. I think on, well actually I guess we can hear a few other questions. I'm sure there'll be more conversations. I don't need to hear my own thoughts on this anymore.
But I had the question, there seems to be a growing consensus that state funding of schools will go up by a few $1 billion, and it's just a question of what the number is. Where does the money come from? Has that been discussed?
Yeah, the good news is that the Texas economy has been pretty strong over the last 2 years, and the biennial revenue estimate went up. I think I want to say about 10%, and so, as complicated as property tax and school finance are, they're not going to be the only issues that are going to get addressed. We have a range of issues that probably are going to require us to tap into the rainy day fund, including, I know the governor's going to be focused on school security, but obviously the Harvey reconstruction and a couple other items as well. So the short answer is it's going to come out of general revenue, I believe. One of the things I know Republicans are pretty principled on and pretty set on is they don't want to use the rainy day fund for ongoing expenditures, right? And obviously property tax or school finance, that would be every biennium, right? Harvey is the perfect example of truly a rainy day, the kind of thing that the rainy day fund exists for, and so tapping that, for that purpose, I think is almost surely going to happen. So, bottom line is, I think they're going to take, I forget how much more we have to spend this biennium versus last biennium, but the lion's share of that, I think, is likely to go to whatever this ultimate solution is on property tax and school finance.
And the challenge on that, of course, is that we had good economic times and we had bad economic years. Last time we reformed property taxes seriously was in 2007, it was 2006 and 7, and that was fine. We actually had an increase and things were looking good, and then the economic downturn happened again, and we had massive cuts to education spending in 2011, and we're still backfilling since then. So without kind of, it's the example of the $5,000 teacher pay raise from Senator Nelson. That's fantastic. It's a great bill. It's not sustainable without new revenue sources and new revenue streams over the long run. And that's a baseline reality. The School Finance Commission wouldn't recommend anything. I asked the chair of the commission at a Trip Fest event, are you willing to provide the legislature any cover in recommending any types of places where you could collect more revenue? A quarter of all the potential sales taxes that could be collected in the state of Texas is not. That amounts to about $115 billion in sales tax exemptions we have every year. Some of those are great, like backpacks and your light bulbs that you get, although I just learned that LED light bulbs are not sales tax exempt on this holidays and regular bad light bulbs are, so go figure. But there's some other ones that are, they're just outdated tax exemptions we probably don't need. Is a golf course really a green space, something to be preserving, or is it not, do they deserve the time to pay a property tax break? So I think that ultimately that's something that needs to fix. I'm under no illusion that we're going to raise revenues in any meaningful way, new revenues under this legislature and under this governor. So I think that we've got to try to build a system that, as best we can right now, that can be sustainable. And also considering one thing that it depends on how that teacher pay raise. If it's straight across the board in the current legislation that she's put forward, it's great. It doesn't have to be phased in, and over time, and one of the things that's come out of the School Finance Commission that I know Lieutenant Governor Patrick has praised is either it's outcomes-based or kind of tiering out over 10 years, which is the Finance Commission's recommendation, that school districts get some more of that money in year 1 and then more in year 2, so that you could hire more and more teachers or pay teachers more, but only a certain percentage of teachers can access those dollars over time. What is also hopeful, and has been duly told me, completely separate from the school finance conversation, is the teacher retirement system and kind of shoring that stuff up. Yeah. Fortunately, that is something that can be done more with a one-time expenditure, and hopeful that rainy day fund dollars can come from.
They put $1 billion in last session on that, but it needs more. Absolutely.
Right, so they can put more in there. But again, I think everybody wants to do that, so that's another place where we're hopeful that's going to be, we can achieve that. I will also, on the rainy day fund dollars, there was a legislative budget board, and Speaker Bonin and Lieutenant Governor Patrick were signing off on potentially $1 billion out of the rainy day fund for various expenditures, including things that could deal with school safety improvements, which is encouraging. There's a lot of one-time facility costs that could be done to upgrade and keep our schools safer. The flip side of that is some like counselors and additional mental health services. Those are recurring expenses. And so I think keep an eye on that. Like as that bill moves forward, as those proposals move forward, is that going to be something they're going to try to use rainy day fund dollars for, or is that going to be baked into the school finance fix? Just another key issue as you're studying or following the news and seeing what we're doing and not doing in school finance over the coming months. It's going to be interesting though. I'm very encouraged by many Republicans in the House and Senate and Lieutenant Governor Patrick and Governor Abbott and how I think they're sincere and that they want to get things done. I don't care if their motivations are electoral and they want to protect themselves and not get defeated. That's what elections are for, is to pressure people to do things the right way. And I think if that's the outcome of a close election this past November, successful election generally by many Texas Democrats, fantastic. Let's have another one in 2020 and see what can come. But I think that everybody does want to get something done. I'm really pleased by that conversation, and we'll see. Hopefully that comes through the state of the state, and that not just revenue caps, but school finance as well as put as an emergency item so we can get working right away.
I'll just say one thing. I mean, I'm not quite so cynical as Phillip in the sense that the property tax was they made an effort to try to address that last session before this said, poor outcome electorally. So it's not like they didn't know it was a problem. I do think there's greater urgency, and so I don't think it's just because Republicans lost. I think it's also because the property tax situation's gotten worse in the last 2 years. And if you ask any legislator in either party, what issue do you hear about most in your constituency, property tax would be the answer of 80% or more of them. It doesn't matter where you are, rural areas, urban areas, suburban areas, all geographic areas of the state. So it's a consistent theme and it continues to get worse.
Well, in HB2 and SB2, it's not just about the revenue caps. There's really good things in there about appraisal board review processes, making sure that, and here in Travis County, you enjoy this. Like, they changed that because I saw that because I have a home now and it shows my tax rates. Very clearly what your rates are at each level, how much they've gone up, who's in charge of those rates, and I think that's baked into House Bill 2 and Senate Bill 2. There's some like good, simple reforms in there. It's more is a 2.5 cap going to apply to everyone? School districts are listed in the bill now, that's different than last year. There's a big conversation, is that 2.5% number, could it go up to 4? Do you exempt public safety in that or not? I think it's going to be a tough thing for folks to agree, but the fact that they filed the same bill is a very clear signal from everybody that like this is where our starting point can be. It's also a really strong way to push to keep the bill clean, to not allow amendments that change it. It's a good leveraging tool, I think, by all three of the big officials, but look, they were elected for those positions, and they're negotiating very, very well on this. Speaker Bonanno offers tremendous at negotiating. I've seen that over the last couple of decades. He's burned our party a number of times, but he's also helped us with things at times. So, we'll see how it plays out. But yeah, there's House Democrats I think they want to provide property tax relief too. We tried to increase homestead exemptions, and the reason it went from 15 to 25 was a big push to that. You might see some conversations about that as well. Representative Rodriguez pointed out in the press response that the only difference between this session and last session is there's 12 more Democrats in the House and 2 more Democrats in the Senate. That's not entirely true though. You have a new speaker and you have an alignment among the big three, and I think that's something that it's real. And we had the Democrats had the election cycle, but Republicans very much still have a mandate in the state, and property taxes are very clearly a top polling issue in either party. So, and I think everyone in this room would love to pay a little bit less on property taxes, I'm sure. So we'll see how it shakes out.
I think we have a number of audience members who are chomping at the bit to get some questions in here. So this is how it's going to work. We're going to welcome questions, short questions, maybe even a short comment on a question. Joanne's going to help me moderate this, as always. We will allow a one short follow-up question for clarification from the audience.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yeah.
And that is that we have a separate question period for each of the topics, so we don't have an intermixture of jumping back and forth from one topic to
Problem is, I
another.
suspect half of the questions will be on topics we didn't cover at all.
Yeah.
Right.
They could be.
Yeah.
They can jump around. It's no problem.
Yeah.
I'm nimble.
What the thing we want to avoid is back and forth debate that monopolizes time with one person.
We will speak more than you.
Okay, Joanne, pick the first person.
I have to pick the first person. Let's start over there.
I'm a retired teacher, so education is my passion. And it is my belief that they keep talking about schools and teachers and what we can do to them. What we need to do is get to the home. And this is one place where Abbott and I agree. He wants full-time, fully funded pre-K for every student in Texas. And I think that is mandatory if we're going to get these kids in low-income homes to where when they start school, they can actually do the work. Is there anything, you all didn't mention that, is that going to come up in this session?
Yeah, absolutely. I know a number of folks have filed legislation already for full-day pre-K. I think Governor Abbott put forward a plan. I think it was the golden standard in 2015, but then they didn't fund it. And so then they rolled it back, and they still made that requirement, but didn't put the money behind it. I think, and I have a primer here, I'll check my numbers, but I think that it's 800 million is what I want to say for full-day pre-K statewide. But it's definitely something that, I know Raise Your Hand Texas, a great group that Charles Butts with HEB has been a large part of. They've been discussing that a lot. And I'll try to find the number, but I know it's going to be, there's no way that there isn't a conversation, and at least on the House side, there will definitely be a vote about full-day pre-K at some form or fashion, and if there's not, I've really screwed up my job.
How would they fund it?
I'm
How
sorry?
would they fund it?
Well, there's $7 billion in new money for schools, so I think some of that is like, where is that going to go? I mean, that's a larger question too. You know, procedurally in the House, they have what they call a put and take rule. So as the budget comes to the floor, they say, this is the money you have to spend. And if I want to add, let's say, $800 million for something, I have to take it away from something else. So you're pitting things against one another. You don't get a chance to add more money anywhere, and that's to help control things from coming too far out of scope. So, I mean, we'll see where they go. I think that's a pre-K thing, and I believe the House budget includes language for full-day pre-K already. And I work in the House, so I haven't read the Senate's budget yet. But Matt, I don't know if you have any insights.
Yeah, I mean, no, I would defer to him on most of that. What I would say is, conceptually, obviously, the earlier you can educate children, make sure they stay on grade level. Honestly, it's not just good for the child, good for the family, but it's a great way to save money over the long term. In terms of not needing remediation, not needing special education, stuff like that. So that said, pre-K is full day pre-K for every child in Texas is something that the party is not behind in terms of its agenda. Doesn't mean there aren't some number of Republicans who are for it, but I just don't think, broadly speaking, they're not for it. And part of the challenge of that is, it is a mandate. It does have a high fiscal note associated with it, and it is outside the, obviously, kindergarten to 12th grade time frame. And so it adds, you can make an argument that it sort of grows government, it extends that period of time, and it makes an additional fiscal commitment from the state. I know I have seen studies that pre-K is sort of modest in terms of how successful it's been. I know I saw a study related to the San Antonio program that Julian Castro put in place. I'm not the world's greatest expert on it, and obviously if my wife and I are lucky to have children, I'm sure we will look at pre-K. And we're fortunate enough to be able to handle that on our own. There are a lot of people who aren't, and it's generally the poorer families who need it more than ours do. So I'm very sensitive to that. I certainly want it to. I think the priority in the past has been more for families of high risk and greatest need, and so I think that might be a great intermediate step. Just to really focus in those areas. But the challenge is, as we were saying before, if you've got $8 or $9 billion to put into the school finance fix, if you put some towards pre-K, you're not going to be able to put it towards that K through 12 range, right? You put one here, you have to take from somewhere else. So that is I think a risk that's there. But I think Phillip's right. I mean, there will be a push for full-day pre-K. It'll be interesting to see whether the governor sort of sticks by that and really puts some muscle behind it. I know that there's a little bit of what's the right word? He sort of talked a good game on pre-K. Was that 2 sessions ago? I think it was.
2 sessions, yeah.
Yeah, and then kind of backed away a little bit. And he had a number of his members on the Republican side walk the plank and then not really get cover from him. That's the memory that they have. So there are some frayed sort of nerves a little bit on that issue with this governor inside, particularly in the Texas House. So that's another just political reality that has to be dealt with as well.
I'll have a small quick plug for anybody here in Austin. Avance Austin does early childhood education, age 0 to 3, and parent childhood educations for low-income Latino families. I'm actually the president of the board for that. I chair the board for that organization. So if anyone would like to learn about that organization, get involved, I'm happy to talk afterwards. Not even donations, just time and energy, volunteers. We love it.
I'd like to preface my question by thanking both Matt and Phillip for sharing with us their extensive knowledge about the Texas legislature and their deep understanding of how it works. My question concerns a column in, I think it was today's paper by Ellen Troxclair, who said that it's commonly understood that the property taxes have to go up to make up for the lack of funding by the state legislature. She said it's actually the other way around, that the property taxes go up and then the state legislature fills in what's missing. Could you explain to me which of those, if either of them is correct?
I think there is a bit of an ideological divide on that question. I do believe it's the latter, but I also believe it's more complicated than that. I think that one thing that I think is fair to say is counties have to provide services, and so if you don't provide at the level they need, they're going to do what it takes to make sure they have the resources they need to provide. And so I do know that the state has my understanding is the state's put additional pressure on the counties, on the cities in the last couple of sessions, and that's exacerbated this. But I do think, appraisal reform is seriously overdue. We just shouldn't be seeing 8, 10, 12, 15% increases year over year anywhere. There's no reason for that anywhere. You can't, to me, I don't think blaming the state explains that. You're not seeing cuts that are so sharp that it would necessitate that. So I think it's probably part of it. I think part of it is probably the counties, kind of doing what they, raising as much revenue as they can within the limits. It's one of the reasons why our rollback rate, reducing the percentage needed for rollback rate was an idea that I know the Senate was very excited about last session, right? If you forced counties to explain why property taxes were being increased, right? If they were able to make a good case, right, that would be one thing. They don't really have to make a case. Yes, they have to stand for election, but that's every 4 years, and they're obviously raising property taxes every year. So I'd be interested to see what Phillip's answer is on this. I think it is complicated. I think it's a little bit of both.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a. It's like not touching, can't get mad. I mean, she's technically right. Functionally, the way it is that the way that state law is written is that the state will fill in the amount of money beyond what is put in by local governments to pay for schools and other services, hospitals, everything else. So if counties weren't raising that money, then the state would have to put that in. But the problem is the state budget is written in such a way that it assumes collections go up a certain amount because they know that's what's going to happen. Now, if the state budget removed that specific rider under the Texas Education Agency, and they didn't have that assumption, and they just budgeted for $5 billion less coming from local governments, then the state would either have to fill in that money, or there'd just be a $5 billion cut. Senator Hancock made this argument actually in response to our statement that we put out regarding the governor's presser, was that, you all say you want more money from the state, well, this is how you do it. You reduce local governments putting more money in, and then the state comes in on the backside and puts more money in, and we'll be fine. That's an easy thing to say, again, when you have an economic upturn and you get an extra $10, $11 billion you can spend. There's no guarantee that's sustainable going forward. So I think that, there's kind of a standoff, if you will. The local governments want to see the state put that more money in, and then they're like, cool, we don't have to raise taxes as much. I think that, if the state put more money in, and then immediately after they said, now you can't grow like we're doing, you said you can't put more money forward and you can't raise it as much, you cap what you can raise, then they're like, okay, well, we don't need to as much to fill up for those schools. And the flip side of this, of course, is that people are fine with spending money for more schools. I think it's like 83% of local bond elections put more money into schools passed in the state of Texas by 3/4, and more passed by smaller margins. So it's one of those where if you actually put these up to voters, they pass, and if people don't want to spend more money, they don't. We don't have rail in the city of Austin because people didn't want to spend the money on it. We couldn't get consensus, and whether or not that's good or bad, that's local accountability. Like, well, we don't want to have our tax rates go up to pay for this type of mass transit, so we haven't done it. And so I think she is technically right, and I know this is a very well-argued line of theory that's coming from the Texas Public Policy Foundation. I've read it very closely. Not touching, can't get mad.
But that doesn't take into consideration recapture.
Correct.
So that's,
It's a different piece of the
it's
formula.
a different piece, but it
Affects
affects
it,
property
no doubt.
taxes
Sure.
and
No
The
doubt.
equalizing of money and how you weight how much money is subject to recapture and can be sent out to recapture is another weight in the scales they're trying to balance.
Well, and I think on a per capita basis, my understanding is that Austin ISD is the single most disadvantaged school district based on recapture. And so that just doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, I can understand why we'd be in the top 5 or the top 10, but number 1 overall, it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, first let me say thanks to the panelists. It's really great to see bipartisan discussion of current topics. Second, I have 2 short questions. One is, I recently heard Speaker Bond say that legislation on vouchers and on bathrooms is not going anywhere this session. So I appreciate what y'all have to say about that. Secondly, what's the discussion and what can we expect in terms of our spending on infrastructure, which I think all of us in the room know is we badly need to work on infrastructure.
Yeah, let me take the first one, maybe have Phil take the second one, or take both. Just because I don't remember what the budget has, what the initial budgets have on infrastructure, but I do think you're going to see some rainy day money go towards infrastructure. But on the first question, so yeah, the bathroom bills, I don't believe it's even been filed. Keep one thing in mind.
Patrick said it's done. He won on it already.
Well, yeah, and, you know, we can laugh about that, and I do think that there's a huge disconnect between the perception of how much time the quote bathroom bill took up and through the legislature and how much it actually took up. You know, I think that I mean, this is a bit of a partisan statement, but I think the media and the Democrats thought sort of they could make Republicans look ridiculous by talking about the bathroom bill, asking people about it every day, you know, talking to different people to see who was going to boycott what next. Keep one thing in mind, right? And I'm not saying I'm for the bathroom bill, but understand that the Republicans legislature believed it was necessary because the Obama administration put an executive order in place that told school districts you can have your own bathroom policy, right? So wasn't a theoretical, you know, threat or problem or challenge. It was that executive order is what necessitated this from that perspective. And it's not even theoretical because you had Dripping Springs and Fort Worth announce new bathroom policies without consulting their PTAs. And you can imagine how a lot of parents responded to that. Didn't respond well. In fact, both school districts pulled those policies back after hearing from parents. What's changed, in addition to the fact that I think, broadly speaking, Republicans have realized that issue's a loser, but what's really changed is that Trump rescinded that executive order, right? So there's no federal government cover being given to a school district taking unilateral action on that issue. That said, as I said before, I think it's a loser. I think it's not helpful. It divides the party. Democrats are obviously against it. You've seen all kinds of threats made by the NFL and other people. It's not helpful, and it's not what the session's going to be about. So yeah, that's a dead issue. Vouchers, you know, I do believe that we're going to continue to move towards more competition and more market-based forces in education. As you probably know, the Senate did pass additional school choice legislation last session. There's always been a huge divide between the House and Senate on the issue of school choice. And really the divide that you see is not always partisan as much as it is urban versus rural. And the reason for that is that the districts that have large numbers of rural counties end up having, number one, very few options in terms of outside public schools, very few charter schools, very few private schools. And so they don't really see the benefit, and they don't really see the reality of how those options can work. And in many cases in those rural areas, the public high school, public middle school is the largest employer. It's sort of the cultural center. The football team is the most important, you know, sort of thing, right? And so they see that as a way to sort of weaken something that's very strong in their community. And so I do think that in the House, the votes are not there for school choice legislation. I think Bonin realizes that's divisive, and he wants to try to keep, you know, the House together as much as possible. He wants to address the big issues. He doesn't want to sort of let these things in the second and third tier have them, you know, lose momentum. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the reason bathrooms is a big issue is that Lieutenant Governor made it a big issue. He wanted to talk about it. He wanted to use transgender Texans as a wedge, and you know, they lost on it, and I'm glad it's over. In the Capitol, if you're on the basement of E2, there's a wonderful little sign that has men and women next to it. It's a family restroom, and anybody can go in and use that. I think we've moved past it. I'm glad everyone's moved past. I think honestly, most Republicans in the House and in the Senate were glad we moved past it too. They didn't particularly like that issue. It was a federal issue that really impacted the local folks, and if Dripping Springs had gone to their PTA, it wouldn't have been a big issue. And if the president just hadn't seen a need to do this, he wouldn't have used that executive order. But we've all moved on, and I think there's other larger federal concerns at this point in time right now. Vouchers have been dead for 20 years. I think Republicans just got tired of losing on that issue, and they have moved on to charters. On charters, again, like most of the increased money you've seen in public education has gone straight to charters. PolitiFact had a great breakdown of this based on a claim that Representative Howard had made. 100% of charters are funded by public school dollars, which is obviously, or state dollars go to 100%. Charter schools get all their money from the state. I figured out how to say it. That's not true with, obviously, normal public schools, so that's something interesting. But again, only about 6.5% of the student population is in charter schools right now, so the vast majority of public education focus is on public schools. As far as infrastructure spending, I guess it kind of depends on what type of infrastructure, because you have so many different areas. If there's a specific...
Well, just roads, bridges.
Roads and bridges.
Or transportation.
I think you'll see a lot of money put forward to fix the 43 counties that were impacted by Hurricane Harvey. I think you'll see a lot of dollars go to there. We passed a constitutional amendment in 2015 that says that certain percentage of money of the Economic Stabilization Fund automatically goes to help support TxDOT and more roads and bridges and everything. The most interesting conversation that we're going to see, which won't be a partisan issue, is the high-speed rail from Dallas to Houston. I think there's a really big push on that. I know there's a lot of lobby money behind that, a big push for that. I don't know if they've unlocked exactly the puzzle for that, but I mentioned in the beginning that it takes 6 to 8 years for an issue to really come up and become successful in some of these. They're on year 5 and 6 right now for that high-speed rail in terms of lobbying efforts that have been made. So I think there'll be a very interesting conversation on that front, on that issue.
You don't think Southwest Airlines will put a kibosh to it? They did last time.
Can I just say one thing on charters? There's a lot of, and I'm not saying Phillip doesn't understand this, there's a lot of misunderstandings about charter schools. Charter schools are public schools. In order to exist, they have to have lotteries, so they can't handpick all white kids, all rich kids, all kids reading at grade level. They can't do that at all. I know there's been some conjecture that maybe they move kids that have special needs out so they can keep their high performance. I don't know the facts of that. I do know that on Idea Public Schools and Austin Achieve, both of which are active here, have been incredibly successful in the Austin area. And charter schools, until this past session, they were 100% state funded in terms of operation, but they were 100% privately funded in terms of construction and land acquisition. So they were at a disadvantage compared to state-funded public schools. I believe that treatment has been more evenly balanced. I don't know if it's a one-to-one yet, but I believe towards the end of the session they are now providing some public dollars for the construction and the land acquisition. I think that's a positive thing. One of the things Dan Patrick is most proud of is when he was Senate Education Chair, he worked in a bipartisan way to increase the cap on charter schools on a stair-step pathway. And so I'm not sitting here telling you every single charter school has been 100% successful. Failing charter schools get shut down far more quickly than failing public schools do. But I do believe charter schools are a big part of the answer about how we're going to reform the public education system, to give parents more choices, to raise standards, to have higher performing schools. And in fact, charter schools are able to be far more innovative than public schools are.
And you're definitely right. There's definitely good charter schools, bad charter schools. My mom taught at American Youth Works, a charter school here for a long time. There's good and bad things about that school, and that tends to be the case across the board. There's other models, though, that I think can work if you have schools that aren't successful and you need to have other folks. Reagan High School went through the communities and school model, which is very successful. They had a huge transformation at their campus. Representative Eddie Rodriguez, I was trying to find the bill number, filed House Bill 92, Community Schools Bill. If you're interested, I highly recommend you taking a look at it. It has campus turnaround plans where it's required that the teachers and the parents and local leaders, they have to come together and create a plan to turn around the school, but it keeps it very anchored in that neighborhood space. And Matt spoke very eloquently about what the value of public schools in some of these rural areas and how it's the public center and it's a space, and there's that can and should be true for a lot of local city schools as well. I think the difference is that it's the only option, so they kind of have to make it work in some areas. Here in Austin, they're like, oh, well, why can't I just drive this other area? Which you can apply for district, transfers of schools. Why didn't you do that? Why am I stuck having to be in this? My means allow this. The community schools model has proven successful, not only here in Reagan, but other areas around the state. I think his House Bill 92 is a fantastic plan, and I would encourage y'all, call his office, support it, ask it, look more about it. Just don't tell Summer I told you to do that, because she'll get mad at it.
I'd be remiss if I didn't just say one last thing on school choice, and that is, the reality is school choice does exist currently. If you have means, you move, you put your child in a private school, right? If you've been reasonably successful in the world and you're privileged enough, you would never accept your child being stuck in a failing school, right? And so the system now, and I'm not blaming anyone, I'm not blaming a teacher or a school superintendent, they all do the best they can with what they have under difficult circumstances. But the reality is that basically poor families are stuck in wherever they live. It's not something where they can sell their house and move to a nice district. So I do think giving parents more choices is something that everyone should be able to get behind. Doesn't mean we want to look at public schools and say, good luck, we're going to look at all these other options. But I do think having more options is a good thing. More competition is a good thing. It fosters innovation, it rewards success. It's one of the things we've seen with Idea Public Schools. If you look at charter schools, they are almost always located in underprivileged areas, right? And that's because they go, basically where the customers are, right? Where the need is greatest. So I know there are good faith concerns about a voucher school choice type of model in terms of accountability, in terms of how the money can be spent, in terms of what it would mean to public schools. I think there are some reasonable questions in those areas.
Okay. We did not guess ahead of time that this would have been such a big discussion topic. Let's move on to
Thank you. So in listening to the questions coming and also what you've said, I'm kind of distilling all of my thoughts into this one thing. And it's really I'm going off of what you just said, if you have the means. So kind of all of my questions come from my personal biases. I'm first generation, not legally barred from an education. My dad didn't go to high school because of segregation. My uncle got lynched for wearing his army uniform on Sunday. So I have a very definitive bias. And I'm also working class. I'm a single mom. I'm well articulate, I'm intelligent, and I'm a go-getter. So my daughter generally hasn't had so much of the single mom stigmatism, but what I have noticed, and in my own experience, across the board on all of the topics that we've discussed, I'm not hearing anything for working class, poverty level, and below poverty level people having access to any of these things. And I'm hearing a lot of class bias. So specifically with the schools. Charter schools and choice and being in disadvantaged areas, that's all well and good. But charter schools have no requirement for SPED. There's nothing for that. So if you have a special needs kid, you're not going to be able to get 504 accommodations or SPED level services at a charter school, even though it's publicly funded. So you're also not going to get busing. So if you're working, and this ties into the voter, where you're saying there's ample opportunity for people to vote. Yes, maybe, but this is a right to work state. So servers, and I've hustled in California, where I'm from, where I've worked as a waitress, and I'll make $600 in tips, but my baseline was $12 an hour. Whereas here, it's like $1.25 to $12 an hour. That's insane. So there are working families, and I've met people, and I know people here.
I want to give these people a chance to talk.
Well, yeah, so my question is, ultimately, what about this idea of meeting people's needs? So the two things that I hear...
So let them respond.
Well, no, that's not my question. Those are all of my backgrounds of my responses.
I think that's fair. We said up front that you can provide a comment first, and she did. I appreciate that. And what's your question?
So this is my question. So in thinking about these things, basically people's motivation is their unmet needs. So people that are property owners oftentimes are cut out of the social safety net, and I put air quotes on that because they're property owners, so they can't access things that other people can access because they own property. They're immediately cut, regardless of their need. And then on the flip side, working class people, their salaries aren't based on actually living wage calculators. Like MIT has an excellent living wage calculator.
You are very articulate, but what's
So
the
my
question?
question is, would it be possible to base these numbers of some of this policy off of actual quantifiable numbers, like MIT's living wage calculator? So for the teacher's salary increase, as opposed to across the board, you know, someone in Austin 5,000 versus someone in Waco 5,000.
Okay,
That's gonna have a huge
so
impact.
we got the question.
Well, first of all, I want to say I appreciate your question. I'm sorry you're being rushed to the end of it. I think
Thank
that like we all have like none of us. I don't know everybody in this room. I don't have the same background you have. I think it's important to hear that. And I think it's for everyone in like these kind of rooms and these kind of settings to hear directly from people's backgrounds for this, because when we don't and we assume we know something about who you are and the life you've lived, then I think we've cut out an opportunity to learn that is as important as hearing my point of view and what you have to say. So thank you for sharing your background, and I'm happy to visit a little bit more after that. There are mechanisms and instruments to be able to create policy based on those types of indicators. So what is a living wage baseline? Let's work upwards from there on establishing it. I think some of that in the school finance piece is what they're looking at. So when I describe the English language learner programs and economically disadvantaged programs, the simplest way I've been able to describe it is there's kind of the baseline number. Every student's getting at least the basic allotment. So right now that's $5,140 per student. We want to increase that to about $5,770. I think that's the recommendation from some. If we get somewhere in between there, we've made good progress. But then on top of that, what extra money per child of a certain population will a school district receive? And that's where they're saying, well, oh, you get this much more money because it requires this much to teach or provide needs for somebody who is an English language learner, for somebody who is a special needs student, for somebody who is economically disadvantaged, for somebody that needs extra money for lunch, for extra transportation allotments for schools to help make sure that kids are getting there. The problem is the weights, so how much the inputs into the formulas, how much on each of those kind of different measurements have been updated in 20 to 30 years.
Oh, good God.
So that's a challenge right there, is that, yeah, we're using numbers and we're assuming certain things as if, you know, like I were 3 years old, which I am not anymore, like clearly. So I think that's where this conversation needs to be updated, and that's where folks recognize, like, oh yeah, we're anchoring the entire public school system under formulas that were written so long ago, and the economic times have changed. Even with, broadly speaking, maybe the state of Texas in the aggregate is doing well. Obviously, many families aren't. Many, you know, we still have more minimum wage folks than I think any other state, or second most, I can't remember. So that's part of the work that's being done. And I won't speak to the motivations. That's why any one person from any one party or any one district might be doing that. But I think there's broad recognition from Republicans and Democrats that this is a bad way of doing the numbers. It's a bad way of creating a public school system, and they want to fix it. How much they fix those numbers will come into play and address some of that. Now, obviously there's indicators across all public policy areas that I wish that we were considering the same way. I'm happy to talk to you about some of the others afterwards if you'd like. But that's my answer on the school conversation anyways.
Fair enough, thanks.
Okay.
And I certainly have heard exactly the same thing in terms of the different legislators who have talked about the formula, and that the formula is based on data that's old, ancient data.
There's another element too, that PTAs supplement all sorts of things, so people on one side of the city the students get additional support, on the other side of the city, they get zilch. That's the problem.
So, you're talking about spending half of the so-called additional funding for public schools on teacher salaries. And you mentioned, there was just brief mention once of the issue of retirement, which is a big piece of what it costs for a school to, I mean, we have a humongous teacher turnover, you know, in only a matter of a couple of years, half of the new teachers are gone.
Yep.
And that's not just a problem that's unique to Texas, it's all over the place. And people that were trained to be teachers just say, to hell with this, I'm going to find something else to do and go work for Mike Dell at 3 times the salary. Okay, so you've got that problem. And the retirement, and then there's another big piece of money that all schools have to have something for, which is the medical programs and the medical insurance, the medical coverage for the teachers and all their employees. And it's been mentioned twice now when we're talking about this issue of who covers what and who slides in and recapture and all that. Rural school districts in this state are just being slammed. And when the health care budget for their insurance, for their employees goes up, when the teachers' salaries are terribly low and you're having a hard time recruiting people and you can't keep them there, and you can't afford to cover, the retirement's based on their salary. So that's proportionate. So how is it that you manage this whole problem of recapture or replace it with something else so that there's adequate educational experience for people that live in, and I could throw in special education.
Do you want to talk about it? Do you want me to?
How do you deal with it?
I'm not going to have a very satisfying answer on this, also. I'll leave it to Phillip. You raise a lot of great aspects of this. Obviously, improving, the school finance reform is not just about putting more money in. It's also about updating the formula and making sure it works for as many school districts as possible, but also making sure that we're getting better outcomes. I do think the teacher raise proposal that's in the Senate budget is intended to help retention. And I do know, as we talked about earlier, I do believe the legislature will put, I don't know how much, $1 billion or $2 billion probably back in TRS for retirement for the future, which will again help them get back to where they need to be. So again, I don't have all the answers on your question. You raised a lot of
the medical budget,
good parts of it. Yeah, I don't know enough about that.
So yeah, you have the kind of current teacher healthcare stipend portion. So that's something that can be in the school finance formulas, but the retirement piece is completely separate. So again, the way the budget is, you have the Texas Education Agency,
right,
and there's a whole other area of the budget that's retired teachers. So that's just appropriate that money with general revenue dollars, or other stream of money, and get the rates up so that people are getting retirement they were promised. So that's something that is, the state keeps falling behind. Very serious effort to kind of continue the committal to catch up to that. And there's a great long-term proposed way to deal with that. I want to close the loop on the healthcare stipend. I know that's something that the last time there was a big discussion of, do we need a huge pay raise, or we can have this much of a pay raise, but if you can help cover my healthcare costs, because I can't, that'll actually be a little bit better for me. And I will offer that the $5,000 cross-board teacher pay raise is, it's excellent. I work closely with all 4 of the major teacher organizations in the state, and they're not going to say no to a teacher pay raise, but that's not the #1 issue before them at that level. I think there's other pieces of that, including health insurance. So we'll see where it shakes out in the end. The quick thing, I'll try to keep this brief, on long-term kind of retirement solutions is that Comptroller Hager, Republican, has a brilliant plan on this. The Economic Stabilization Fund, the Rainy Day Fund, it keeps getting up and up, and we're going to be at about $15.5 billion, hitting the $16 billion limit we have on it pretty soon. Well, what happens if we start, right now you take some of that money, you redirect it to transportation. What if you start redirecting that money and put it into this other bucket where you get a return on investments? And then that return on investments is that extra 7 to 8% you get on that return, that starts going towards your long-term pension systems, both for employees, state employees, and retired teachers. And then in maybe 10, 15 years, depending on how often you can move that money over, you have a chance to really solve that. Cool, our pension system is figured out, because we're going to constantly have money in here that's generating more money, and that's going to pay for these pensions. I think it's a brilliant idea. There's not another one like it in the nation right now. He actually spoke to the House Democratic Caucus recently and shared that Joanne Fleming, who's a major Tea Party advocate in I think it's in Tarrant County, in Northeast Texas. She actually is 100% behind this, and they have been coming out strongly in support of it. I know he told us he was going to be meeting with the Lieutenant Governor and sharing that, and tell Joanne to give him a call too to see if there's a way that he could kind of get that proposal in place. He also said, respectfully, House Democrats, do not talk about it. Stop supporting it. Let's get the Republicans to support this plan. But it's a great example of, Comptroller Hager has shown a really strong command of the state's finances, and he's very transparent and honest. And that's the kind of way you can deal with long-term kind of pension security, if you will. In the meantime, yeah, we're going to have to go back to the rainy day fund and shore it up until we have a more steady long-term stream. But those types of plans and conversations are happening for sure.
Just to clarify, when you say get a return on investment, are you talking about stock
So right now,
markets?
you invest the money the way you would any return. So like right now, that money is really just sitting in more like your regular savings account, which isn't going to get it, like it's getting minimal dollars back at all. When it could be going into other funds that are managed, like the foundation school fund that gets a return on investment and others, where it's generating revenue for the state. And you could create a system where money going towards that bucket automatically goes to these other places like pension security, long-term pension security, so that it's not money that gets swept away for other needs down the line.
I do one more
So
question.
like the lotto?
Yeah, well, that was my question. So you answered one of my questions. I just have another question, and we'll get to some other. And that is,
Moderator discretion.
so you mentioned that voter fraud takes place mostly in mail-in ballots, which we have seen over time. So my question then has to do with photo IDs, and if photo IDs are necessary, why is it not sufficient then for students to be able to use their ID that's issued by the school in which they attend?
Yeah, Matt, how come?
No, it's a good question. First of all,
So
state-issued
is there any
state-issued IDs are far more secure and harder to manipulate or to copy than a university ID would be. So it's really that simple. I mean, if we're going to allow that, are we going to allow other types of identification? To me, so that
you don't have to, you can just.
Let's let
well, my point is that look, when the voter ID law was proposed, which has now been fully upheld by every legal challenge, the predictions were chicken little predictions. We've had almost no problems whatsoever with the voter ID law in Texas. There just haven't been. There haven't been hardly any problems anywhere. Are there some places in very rural areas where you have to drive an hour or something to get an ID? Sure. First of all, I think that the percentage of people who don't have a driver's license who are trying to vote is a pretty small population to begin with. But the state did say we are going to provide, I believe they're free, state IDs. They're not driver's licenses, but they're an ID that allows you to vote. So I think it's more a question of the problem with having a university ID is every university has their own standards for what those IDs are, how they're made, whether they're counterfeit proof, etc. Whereas the state has one standard, right? And they have confidence in that process and in that standard. So I think it's mostly about that more than anything else. Obviously, college kids can register in the place where they're living while they're going to college. That's something that Democrats, really worked hard on this cycle, and I think benefited from. So there's nothing that's keeping them from registering in the area where they're going to college. But I don't see a lot of movement towards moving towards college IDs being able to be used for voter ID.
I wanted to go back to the pension for a moment. The private sector went through a reform about 10, 20 years ago from a defined benefit plan to a defined contribution plan. And for whatever reason, public sector has not followed suit. Can you comment on that, please?
Risk.
That's a great point. I don't really have a good answer on that either. Obviously it's politically difficult to do. And one thing about that is particularly challenging is when you change the terms of an agreement that was made between a public sector worker and the state. There's a question of fairness, right? They took a job, they were promised a pension at a certain level. If you change it kind of while they're in the middle, that obviously affects their retirement, and would have profound consequences. So I know what I would say is, for future beneficiaries, moving to that kind of system to me seems like a no-brainer from an actuarial standpoint, from a mathematical standpoint, from a fiscal sustainability standpoint. I do think you just have to consider what it would mean to current beneficiaries, current pensioners. Perhaps you could do it for people who are 45 and under, that way they can plan for it. going forward. But I haven't unfortunately heard a lot of discussion about that, but it would make a hell of a lot of sense, and it would help the state from a fiscal standpoint if that happened. As you probably know, these kinds of reforms that are fairly common sense always happen in the private sector before they happen in the public sector, and I think we all know why that is.
Would you have the optional retirement program, would that be a defined contribution as opposed to a defined benefit? So that there is some availability.
I think that the question is a defined benefit is like there's guaranteed money that you're going to be getting in. I think that's a challenge. Like, are you going to guarantee the money? You're going to guarantee that they're going to get something.
Now, we usually try to end a little bit early so people can flock up and have personal discussions here.
Yeah, should I, one more question?
Well, she had one
Oops,
earlier.
but you haven't asked a question.
Yeah, simple question. If every county is updating their voter registration records yearly, where's the Secretary of State getting his numbers from?
The numbers came from DPS, from Department of Public Safety. And obviously they don't, DPS has records related to when people got their driver's license. They don't have necessarily records as to when people registered to
Why would you
vote.
go to that in the first place if you've got the counties who have been checking their numbers?
Well, because DPS is statewide, whereas you'd have to go to 254 counties individually, and 2/3 of those are pretty rural counties. Would take quite a bit of time. I think it was an easy way for them to just get an initial count to see what the numbers look like, and then they could go to the counties and say, here's your list. Travis County of 4,000 people. Will you look at it? If there's anyone on here that's illegal, will you purge them from the system, or will you contact them? I believe that was the intention. Again, poorly handled, and they put too much attention on the top line number, not enough attention on the bottom line result.
So
Well, they could have too, like they could have been done it quietly, because the reality is this past week they've quietly been notifying counties about potential problems, and they aren't blasting out press releases admitting their errors. But I think there is pretty clear intention of what they wanted to do and what they wanted the story to be. The upside is that I think the media has done a tremendous job of holding them accountable to this. The numbers are going to bear out and we're still a far way away. The challenge is that anytime you're using DPS data at the front end, like there's a lot of problems with DPS data. In 2012, there was an attempt at purging voters and identifying folks who shouldn't be there. The Houston Chronicle examined it and they found 68,000 names that the state was attempting to purge shouldn't be tried to be purged from voter rolls. This is something that happened in various forms in Kansas and Georgia and South Carolina. You've had problems just in the last calendar year anyways. The DPS thing was 2012 here in Texas. So I think it's good to be vigilant, when you see these things, and to treat these types of announcements with a healthy dose of skepticism and not immediately assume that there is a problem until you can look at the data. Media's done a great job of that. Texas Tribune did a great job of that. Really, everyone except the Statesman did a great job. The Statesman just kind of ate it immediately, and they actually had to change their headline and publicly announce it, changed it to more accurately reflect what was going on. But who knows? I don't know. Maybe the Statesman just had somebody who was a first-time person working the headline machine that day.
So I hope that you can all, do you want to close
Yeah,
the station?
My closing statement is that my dream is we send this tape to KUT and say, this is how you have a discussion that is actually informative as opposed to a lot of just political spin. And suggest that they do something like this, maybe 2 guys on your ledge, or
Two gals on your ledge too.
I do want to thank Matt and Phillip for coming here and participating so well in this. And thank all of you folks for coming here too. I know you have many things you can do. As we close up here, feel free to come up and ask additional questions, have a discussion. Those of you who are able, we do appreciate any help putting the chairs stacked together afterwards. There's probably some coffee and cookies still back in the end there.
Yeah, we have coffee and cookies for anyone who would like. And March 2nd, Allison Alter and Jimmy Flanagan will be here talking about local regulation. So it should be really interesting.
Thank you.
Let's thank our speakers.